How to Sell Anything to Anybody by Joe Girard with Stanley H. Brown. Introduction. You've got this book in your hands because you think it can help you get more out of your work, more money, and more personal satisfaction. This probably isn't the first book about selling that you have read. Chances are you have seen and read a lot of other books. Books that promise to give you the secrets, the magic, the inspiration. You probably already know a lot about how to hype yourself by looking in the mirror every morning and repeating certain phrases to yourself. By now you know the mysteries of PMLA and HPD and some other magical power expressions and attitude builders. You know a lot about what you should think and what you shouldn't think, positive and negative. And maybe you are a little confused by this time from all the contradictory advice the books have offered. I don't want to take anything away from the promoters, the experts, and the other well-meaning people who grind out all those books. They have to make a living too. But let's face it, what you want to know is how to sell real products and services now. And most of those authors never sold very much in their lives, except their books. They may be professional writers or professional sales training experts. Some of them may have spent a few weeks or months selling something until they figured out something at which they were better. And maybe one of them made a good living selling one multi-million-dollar real estate development every 2 years, which has nothing to do with the kind of selling you do and want to do better. That's the point. They just aren't our kind of salesmen, out there selling every day for a living. They don't do it because they have to. When you read their books, they sound fine, and they probably give you a little help, maybe even enough to earn back what they cost you. But when you think about those books, you realize pretty soon that these writers, even the best of them, just aren't our kind of salesman. But I am. I sold cars and trucks. New ones, at retail, no fleet deals, just new cars and trucks, one at a time, face to face, belly to belly, to the same kind of people you sell to, every day. Maybe you sell cars or suits or houses or appliances or furniture or something else, day in and day out, something that you have to sell a lot of to make out. And when you read these books by the experts, you probably have the same gut reaction I do. There's something missing. What is missing, your intuition tells you, is firsthand, on-the-job involvement with our problems, our people, our world. Those guys just don't feel like they've been out there in the trenches every day the way we have to be if we're going to eat tomorrow. That's why my book is different. That's why this book is going to work for you in ways that the others never did. Because I was out there every day the way you are. I did what you do. I felt what you feel. I wanted what you want, and I got it. Other people have been called the world's greatest salesmen, but they aren't our kind of salesman. Among our kind of salesmen, I am the world's greatest. You don't have to take my word for that claim. If you want to check me out, take a look at the world's foremost authority, the Guinness Book of Records. To prove I am not a TANA, like the others that say they are #1 with their self-proclaimed records, my claim was audited by one of the top auditing firms, Deloitte & Touche. Look up the world's greatest salesman. You'll find that it's me, Joe Girard, or check stories about me in Newsweek, Forbes, Penthouse, and Woman's Day, or in hundreds of other magazines and newspapers. You've probably seen me on one or another national television show in recent years, and they always introduce me as the world's greatest salesman as attested by the Guinness Book of Records. How well did I do after I started selling in 1963? In my first year, I sold only 267 cars. Only. Even those days that would be more than just a living. In that first year, I was maybe the top guy in the dealership. In 1966, my fourth year, I sold 614 cars and trucks. This is the year I became #1 retail car and truck salesman in the world. And every year since, I was the #1 retail car and truck salesman, increasing my business better than 10% a year and some years as high as 20%, even when we had bad recessions, layoffs, and long strikes. In fact, the worse the economy got, the smarter I worked and the better I did. I have stayed on top even when the auto dealers in the Detroit area cut the work week from 6 days to 5. In 1976, which was my biggest year, I had gross earnings from commissions in excess of $300,000. Not too many beat me, except maybe those guys who spend 3 years paying off some cabinet minister in some country to buy their airplanes or missiles. But that's not the kind of selling you and I are talking about. What we are talking about is a profession that uses skills and tools and experience and practice. It brings us lots of headaches and frustrations, no matter how well we do. But when we do it right, it brings us more financial and emotional pleasure than any other kind of work in the world. I did what I did because I love the money and the excitement and the satisfaction of winning again and again and again. You may already be doing pretty well. You may have a home, a vacation place, a boat, and a couple of cars, but if you have read this far, you think there is more to be had than that. And you're right. There is more of all the kinds of pride and satisfaction every good salesman should feel. In fact, the better you are, the more you should want. If you think you have enough of everything, then you aren't doing as well as you could, so keep on reading. Because I have a total system for selling that is a lot like farming in a country where things grow all the time. With my system, you do a lot of things that are like planting seeds. You do them all the time, and then you begin to harvest all the time. And every time you have harvested a sale, you plant something else. You plant and harvest all the time through every season. There is nothing like it. I guarantee it. But if you think that there is nothing you can do to sell and win, because you're a loser, let me tell you that I was a bigger loser than you have ever been. For the first 35 years of my life, I was the world's biggest loser. I got thrown out of high school. I got thrown out of about 40 different jobs. I lasted only 97 days in the US Army. I couldn't even make it as a crook. I tried twice. The first time I wound up with nothing but a night of terror in juvenile detention. The second time the charges against me were dismissed for lack of evidence. And when I finally got into a business where I was making a small but fairly steady income, the first time I tried to expand, I wound up facing bankruptcy, owing more money than I had ever seen, because I believed somebody who had no reason to tell me the truth. How I got from there to here is what this book is about. This book is not being written by a spectator with a fancy title and a lot of degrees. This is being written by a working salesman who was in the front lines every day selling. Even when I travel around the country giving talks to other salesmen, I am selling, because salesmen have to be sold that the people who show them how to do it know how to do it because they did it. The story of how I got to be the world's greatest salesman gives me an enormous amount of pride. But I get even more from the letters I receive from working salesmen who meet me and hear me talk, and then write telling me how I have changed their lives by making them better, happier, more prosperous salesmen, winning bloodless victories. Remember that for a real salesman, there is nothing better than selling. It is like home runs for a hitter, touchdowns for a running back, victories for a general. But when a salesman sells, there are no losers. Both the buyer and the seller win if it's a good sale. The confrontation that leads to a sale is like a game or a war, but one where nobody bleeds, nobody loses, everybody wins. What's better than that? But the process that leads to that victory should start long before you ever see your prospect for the first time. And it goes on long after the customer signs the order, pays, and leaves with his purchase. In fact, if you think the sale ends when, like they say in the car business, you see the customer's taillights, you're going to lose more sales than you ever dreamed of. But if you understand how selling can be a continuing process that never ends, then you're going to make it to the big time. Once my selling system got into high gear, I never had to look for customers among the people who walk into the front door of the showroom. I didn't take ups. All my customers in those days were people who asked for me by name. All of them. And for every 10 sales I made, roughly 6 of them were to people I sold at least once before. And we're talking about automobiles. People buy them about every 3 or 4 years, and even less often among the middle and working class people who were most of my sales. If you're selling clothes or booze or things that people buy a lot more often, getting them back again and again is even more important. But it is harder to do with cars. So if I can show you the ways I kept people coming back to buy cars from me, you know it's going to mean even more sales for you if you're selling these other kinds of products and services where success depends even more on bringing them back again. I guarantee you that my system will work for you if you understand it and follow it. I looked at selling situations and customers in different ways than I once did. This means that I have changed my attitude about a lot of aspects of my profession. I know there are a lot of people who talk about the importance of attitudes. They tell you that if you change your attitude towards something they have put capital letters on, then everything will be just dandy for you. Most of these people are sincere, but they aren't out there selling face-to-face day after day. Let's face it, we live in the real world, and it is a very tough world. Whatever you are selling, there is probably somebody else out there selling one exactly like it. Not probably, It's a fact. It is a very competitive world, and aside from the thousands of heavy salesmen who are trying to sell exactly the same card to exactly the same customers as I was, there are hundreds of thousands of other salespeople trying to take the same money from them for everything from furniture, houses, swimming pools, and motorboats to vacation trips, tuition, and savings accounts. And when you finally get the customer to come in, he is looking to hustle you in some way, not because he is a bad person, but because he has come to believe that you are. It is a very tough profession we have chosen, but if we choose to deal with it as a profession with rules and standards and principles, it can be made to pay off in financial and emotional satisfaction. The first thing you'd better know, if you don't know it already, is that this is not always a nice world. Competition is a tough game, but everybody competes with everybody else for everything you and they want. I am no philosopher, but I knew that almost from the day I was born. And it is one of the few things I learned before the age of 35 that turned out to be useful to me. What I am trying to say is that the so-called experts are putting ideas in your way that you will either have to get rid of or reshape before they can help you make more money and have more satisfaction from selling. It is a very tough, competitive world. But when I say that, I don't mean that you are going to have to cheat or steal to survive. Stick with me and you will see what I do mean. You will see how you can change people by selling them the right way, my way, and wind up with their money and their friendship. In fact, if you don't get both their money and their friendship, you are not going to be in business very long. Don't get me wrong, when I talk about friendship, I am not talking about goody-goody things like love thy neighbor. How you get along with your neighbor is strictly your business. But when you get to the chapter on the Law of 250, you will understand exactly what I mean by friendship. We are going to deal with the kinds of attitudes customers have towards salesmen and the importance of telling the truth and the value of certain kinds of lies. If you don't understand whom you're dealing with and what they really want to hear, then you can't make it in the long run. I assure you of that. But even before we get to the business of your customers' attitudes, we are going to have to deal with your own. Remember that I was a total loser for 35 years, which I am going to describe with enough detail so you'll start to feel sorry for me, like I felt sorry for myself. But I'll tell you right now that feeling sorry for yourself is a trap. It guarantees that you'll keep on losing. It kills everything that it takes to be a winner in the war of life and of selling. I'll show you that too. And I'll show you how I went from being a loser to being a big winner, the world's greatest salesman, like it says in the book. I did it all by myself. I'll tell you and show you how I did it. And you'll be able to see what you are doing in your own life that is defeating you, and that can be turned around to make you a big winner. I mean that. You'll have to do it to yourself and for yourself. Nobody can do it for you, but I believe that I can show you what I did with my life and why I did it so that you can be guided by it to look at yourself and your life and learn to turn the disadvantages into advantages, the liabilities into assets, the failures into successes, the defeats into victories. Once you have come to that point, you get a set of attitudes built into your head. I know that most of those so-called experts tell you to do it the other way around. That is, they give you the words, the attitudes that you ought to have, and they tell you to develop them. They tell you to make yourself believe them by repeating them every morning when you get up, or by saying them to yourself in the mirror, or some such thing as that. The way to winning attitudes. But if you do that without knowing why or how, it's not going to be worth any more than squeezing a rabbit's foot or rubbing a lucky piece. The only way to have the right attitudes is to know what the wrong ones are and how you got them and why you keep them. And I am going to lead you through the story of my attitudes, the wrong ones, and then the great change in my life that led me to the right ones. Don't get the idea that I'm referring to some magical moment when a finger from heaven touched me. The change in my life came for a lot different and more understandable reasons, as you will discover. I am not saying that what I went through was easy, but I did it. And if I could do it, coming from where I came from, anybody who is sick and tired of being a loser can do it. I guarantee that too. But you have to build in your own version of the right attitudes as the first step. Then you will understand the other rules and parts of my system, and why they work if you work them properly and consistently. The Law of 250 will make it clear why you will want to use the system all the time. When we get to the use of time, you will understand not just the obvious facts about the value of time and the cost of wasting it, but also the importance of being realistic about yourself and what you can do, and how to be good to yourself in the long and the short run. When we get to certain aspects of what I did, I will of course be talking about how I sold cars to people. I will relate what I did to what salespeople in other fields do. A lot of it is obvious, and you can figure it out for yourself. When I say it is essential to get a customer to take a demonstration ride, if you're selling houses, that the equivalent is getting the people into the model, or putting the suit on the customer, or even cooking them a meal if you're selling them a new kitchen. The old-time door-to-door vacuum cleaner salesman used to throw dust and dirt on the floor and then run the vacuum to show how well it worked. The club aluminum salesman cooks a meal when he shows his line. A mattress salesman has got to get the customer to lie down. Those obviously are all equivalents of the demonstration ride in a new Chevrolet. Okay, before we delve into the first chapter, titled The End of a Loser, The Beginning of a Winner, I'd like to share my vision for this channel. My aim is to provide you with valuable insights from these audiobooks, all free of charge. In return, I kindly ask for your support by subscribing to this channel and liking this video. By doing so, you not only help me grow this community, but also join a group of like-minded individuals dedicated to self-improvement and financial success. Thank you for your support. Chapter 1. The End of a Loser, The Beginning of a Winner. Somebody once told me that I was a born salesman. Let me tell you that's not true. Some salesmen, maybe even most salesmen, may be born to it. But I was not born a salesman. I made me a salesman all by myself, and if I could do it, starting from where I did, anybody can. Stay with this story, and you'll soon see what I mean. Lots of people start out poor, but the way it was where I was born was a special kind of poor. Maybe something like the kind of poor these days if you're black and poor. I was born November 1, 1928, on the Lower East Side of Detroit. In those days, it was almost all what you would call Italian, but what I call Sicilian, because to me there's a big difference. I'm proud to be a Sicilian, even though a lot of people, including people from other parts of Italy, discriminate against us and try to make out that all of us are born into some kind of crime syndicate. My strong pride got me into a lot of trouble in my younger days, and even sometimes in recent years. I was pretty quick to fight anybody who called me wop, dago, or greaser. I know that everybody is prejudiced against somebody, but I have never liked it directed against me, and I've bloodied a lot of noses for being called wop, dago, or greaser. The first home I remember was an upper flat in a two-family house across the street from a coal yard. You would think it was a pretty lousy place if you lived across from a coal yard. But it had one advantage. When things were really tough in the wintertime, and the house was freezing cold, my older brother Jim and I could go across the street, and I would crawl under the fence and throw hunks of coal to my brother, who would put them in a burlap bag. Then we'd haul them home and put them in the furnace. Sometimes that was all there was to burn, so it never bothered us that the coal maybe belonged to somebody else. That's the kind of world I was born into. The furnace was in the cellar, but I remember the cellar for another reason. It was my father's favorite place to beat me from as early as I can remember. I guess I was as good and bad as most little kids, nothing special. So I never knew why he did it to me and not to my brother or my two younger sisters. But he did it. Mostly he would take me down there and tie me to a pipe, and then he'd beat me with one of those big leather straps he used to sharpen his razor. Anytime any of the kids made any noise or anything, it was me that got it. Down to the cellar, and him hollering as he whipped me, "You're no good. You'll never be nothing. You're gonna go to Jai," stuff like that. And I never could figure out why me, but he never stopped as long as I lived at home. Sometimes I'd run away a few blocks to the railroad yard down by the river and hide out in the boxcars. Once in a while, I'd even sleep on the straw-covered floors of freight cars. And when I'd come home, he'd beat me again and tell me I was no good and would never amount to anything, and that I'd end up in Jacktown. I'll tell you one thing. If you grow up in a house where your father is the boss, and he tells you you're no damn good from the earliest time you can remember and beats you hard while he's telling you, you believe it. After all, he's the only father, the only authority you know, and he must be right. After a while, I started believing it, even though my mother used to come down to the cellar afterward and tell me that I really was a good boy. That helped some, I guess. But she was not the boss like my old man, so, as much as I loved her, I still believed that I was no good and never would be worth anything. I believed it for a long time, and it had a lot to do with what happened to me, what I did to myself, for most of my life. I have tried to figure out what it was that made him hate me and pick on me and dump on me that way all the time. He came from Sicily as a young man, uneducated, practically illiterate, and poor. His own father had been a tyrant who cursed and beat him. My father was 25 when he married my mother. She was only 15, and her mother was not too happy about her marrying my father. Nobody ever told me what was going on in those days, but a feud started between my father and my mother's mother that never ended as long as he lived. My father wouldn't let any of us, including my mother, have anything to do with my grandmother, even when she lived in the same two-family house. My mother used to sneak into the cellar and talk to her through a partition sometimes, and I would visit her too, because we were very close friends, maybe because of how my father felt about us. Whenever my father found out that I was seeing his enemy, bam, the beating and the hollering and the cursing began again. You're probably wondering what this has to do with how to sell. Well, it has everything to do with how attitudes get planted in your head. And what got planted in my head was that I was no good and that I wouldn't amount to anything. I believed that, and I was going to prove that my father was right. After all, you're supposed to honor and obey your father. But there was another attitude planted there too, from the same beatings and cursings. There was this feeling of wild anger against him and wanting to prove to him that he was wrong, so he'd love me like he loved my brother and my sisters. Sometimes one attitude operated, sometimes the other one, and sometimes they canceled each other out. My father was never able to get much work. After all, it was the Depression, and we were Sicilians in Detroit, and he had no trade, nothing. Mostly he was laid off or on the WPA. We were almost always on welfare, which they called relief in those days, and about the only happy times I can remember were around Christmas when the Goodfellows, a local charity, would send us this box of toys that people had contributed. Mostly they were used and repaired, but it was a big thrill. And even better was the coupon they gave that we could take downtown and exchange for a pair of new shoes. That was a very big deal to me in those days. When I was around 8 years old, I started working. A few blocks from where we lived, there were a lot of factories. U.S. Rubber had a tire plant near the river. There was a big stove factory, and there were some furniture factories and some others. All along East Jefferson Avenue, near these plants, there were working men's bars. I built a shoeshine box and got some brushes and polishes. I don't remember where I got the money for them, and I worked those bars giving shines. If you think you have earned money the hard way, let me tell you that squatting on the floors of crummy saloons, shining shoes for pennies will match whatever you've done. I'd start out in the afternoon after school when the factories were letting out. I'd work all the bars along Jefferson for about a mile, and then I'd come back and start again, maybe more than once in a day. My price was a nickel, if I could get it. Sometimes I'd get a tip of an extra penny or two, and sometimes I couldn't even get more than 2 cents for the whole shine. After a while, I developed some tricky moves like tossing the brushes in the air and changing hands. People got to know me, and I'd get extra tips. In those days of the 1930s, even 1 penny bought a lot of candy, and a nickel bought a double-dip ice cream cone or a quart of milk. The second and third time along the street, I'd see the same guys 3 or 4 drinks later. I saw what booze does to people just in the course of a few hours. Sometimes it would make them easier and maybe more generous, but a lot of times it just made them meaner. After all, these were men who had worked a hard day and were maybe scared they'd lose their jobs. There were more workers than jobs in those days, a lot more, and they had stopped off to unwind and unload their troubles before they had to go home to a poor and miserable house. Working those bars was pretty grim. But I'd work till maybe 10 or 11 at night and come home with about $1, sometimes more. All of it went to the family, and sometimes it was all the money that was coming in. When a plant was closed or there wasn't much business for me for some other reason, and I only brought home a few cents, my father would holler at me and beat me. Those nights I'd be afraid to go home. The fear of not doing well got built into me then, and I'd want to stay out later to do maybe a few more shines. It was a lousy kind of childhood, but I never want to forget it. That's why I keep a big picture of me at age 9 on my knees shining a shoe. I have it hanging on the wall of my office, so I won't forget what I started from. I hated it, but I'm proud of it. My first sales. Maybe there was a little selling experience in going around and practically begging guys to let me shine their shoes. I guess putting on my little act on the floor with the brushes and all was a kind of selling pitch. But where I really learned about one aspect of selling was when I started delivering newspapers. I'd get up at about 6 o'clock in the morning and go to the garage where the Detroit Free Press copies were dropped off to be delivered in the neighborhood. I'd fold them and carry them in a bag on my route, and then go to school and do the shine bit afterward. Where I really learned about selling, though, was when the paper had a contest for new subscribers. For everyone you signed up who stayed for at least a month, you won a case of Pepsi Cola. Now that was a very big deal to me. A case of 24 12-ounce bottles of soda pop was really something. You talk about incentives and motivation. Boy, that really was it for me. I worked every house and every apartment on every street I could find. I rang so many doorbells my fingers got sore. I may even have missed a day or two of school during that contest. But I was persistent. I'd say, "We're having a contest, and I'd like you to sign up for just 1 week." The prize was only if they lasted a month, but I figured that most people would keep taking the paper once they had signed up. I'd tell them how it would be delivered to their door before they got up, which was true. And if they said no, I'd keep on going, never giving up, never being so disappointed that I didn't keep pushing doorbells. It's no fun being turned down, but I soon found out that the more people I talked to, the more sales I made. And that is fun, and better than fun. Because pretty soon the little garage we had behind our house was lined with cases of Pepsi that I could sell in the neighborhood for whatever I could get for them. This gave me more money to bring home, more hope that I could prove to my father that I was worth something. But even that didn't seem to work. I stayed with the Shine box and the newspapers for about 5 years, going to school most of the time, but not doing very well at it. I was not much of a scholar, but I learned some and didn't do too bad when I was there. But the trouble between my father and me never got any better, and maybe a couple of dozen different times he would throw me out of the house. I'd sleep in those boxcars, or sometimes I'd go downtown and take a room in a flophouse at the edge of downtown. It was a crummy part of town, cheap hotels, rooming houses, whorehouses, movies that showed what passed for porn in those days. I'd get a bed in one of those places for a dime or a quarter a night. You didn't get a room. Just a bed in a kind of dormitory with a bunch of drunks sleeping if off or having the DTs. My father would come looking for me after a while and bring me back home and tell me to be good. He did it because my mother made him do it. I guess I'd come home, try school for a while, hang out with the guys on the corner, and then get thrown out again. When I was 16, I was out on the corner one night with these two guys, two friends of mine from the neighborhood. They said, "We're going to knock off this bar over on Meldrum and Lafayette. We cased the joint already, and there's liquor, and maybe he leaves some cash. Want to come along?" It was one of the bars where I used to shine shoes, and I knew the bar. I'd never done anything like that before, but maybe it was because I knew the place or whatever. But I decided to go along with them. Whatever I wasn't a crook. At least not till then. I don't know what decided me to go along, but there I was. When they cased the bar, one of the guys had gone to the John and left the window open. In those days you could do that. Now there would be bars on the windows and alarms and a meter to tell the night man that the window wasn't locked. But not then, even in a crummy, poor neighborhood like we lived in. So about 10 o'clock that night we sneaked into the garage of the Whittier Hotel, which used to be a classy apartment hotel down on the river. We copped a car. I remember it was a Studebaker. I can still hear the garage guy hollering, "Hey, come back with that car." But we just tore ass out of that place and stashed the car on a side street in the neighborhood. Bars in Detroit close at 2 in the morning, so we had to wait till the night men closed the place, cleaned up, and left. It was around 3:30 in the morning when we hit the place. We got the car and drove into the alley behind the bar. There was nobody around on the streets or anywhere. The whole area was completely closed down for the night. I wasn't even very scared while it was going on. In fact, once we got there, I wasn't even scared at all. One of the guys crawled through the window and unlocked the back door. Then we just loaded up the car with all the cases of liquor we could fit into it. It was in the days of World War II. It must have been sometime around May of 1944, and booze was still pretty hard to get. In fact, they rationed it for a while in Michigan. Anyway, once we got the car loaded and cleaned out the register, we took off and hid the booze and split up the money. There was $175 in the till, so my share was nearly $60 plus the $1 a bottle we got from selling the liquor to other guys who hung out on the corner. For me, that was big, easy money, and the whole thing worked so well that I didn't think anything more about it. It's funny when I think back to those days, because I really don't know why I didn't keep on doing it after that first job. I mean, I wasn't that scared or anything, and the money was good, and it figured that we could find other jobs as easy to do. But I didn't do it. I think my old man was bugging me a lot to get a job, and I did get one in some factory. So maybe I was more afraid of him and what he'd do if I didn't go to work. Anyway, I practically forgot about the whole thing, or at least I was trying to, when one day I'm lying in bed at home and I hear a lot of commotion. My mother was crying, and I couldn't figure out what was happening. It never occurred to me that it could have anything to do with breaking into the bar. That had happened 3 months before, and I hadn't had anything to do with those guys after that, and nobody had said anything about it again. All of a sudden, a guy is in my room, and he is shoving me and saying, "Get up." I open my eyes, and a badge is shoved in my face, and this cop says, "Get your clothes on." The next thing I know, I'm at the police station, and this cop and a bunch of others are asking me about the bar burglary and a bunch of jobs pulled at bars and grocery stores I didn't know anything about. But they knew about the one I had been in on. One of the guys had been caught and told about a bunch of jobs he'd done, including that bar, and somehow my name came up. So the next thing, I'm in the juvenile detention home. It was the worst place I'd ever been, a big room full of cots and kids, and this big guy comes around with a strap and makes a kid bend over and starts whipping him. It was worse than a night I spent in a flophouse, where they turned on the lights in the middle of the night to haul out the body of a wino who had died during the night. It was the worst night I had ever spent in my life, and I had spent a lot of nights in a lot of horrible places. In the morning, they brought me out to see the man who owned the bar we robbed. He remembered me and asked me why I did it. I said I didn't know, but that I'd pay him back what I had taken. He said okay, and didn't press charges, so I got out of that place. I would have done anything to get out of there. My father and my uncle came to get me out. My father started beating me as soon as we got outside the building. He beat me in the car, and he beat me when we got home. He kept hollering about the shame I had brought to the family name. This time I really thought I had it coming to me. I had proved to my father that what he had always said about me was true. I was no good, a small-time crook, and I had got arrested. But I also got the scare of my life, spending that night in the juvenile home. No matter what happened, I wasn't going to go through that again. I wasn't going to go to jail like a lot of guys I hung out with wound up doing. So I took a job at the stove company in the neighborhood where a lot of the Sicilians worked. I put insulation into the stove panels, which was a rotten job because the stuff got into your clothes and your skin and your nose and all, and they worked you hard and fast. One day I got caught smoking. It was my second offense, and they broomed me. Broom, that's a word we used for getting fired. It's like you're a piece of garbage and they sweep you out, which is how I felt about myself a lot of the time. I keep thinking that I had about 40 different jobs in those days, but I can't really count them all. I drove a truck for a printer until I got broomed for taking too long on deliveries. I worked at Chrysler Motors making armrests for Imperials. That wasn't too bad. I worked at Hudson Motor Car on the assembly line, which is one of the worst jobs there is because you are attached to the machines and they decide how hard you work. I worked at an electroplating factory where the place was full of vats of hot acid and molten metal, with fumes that got into your lungs. I've had asthma ever since then. I was a busboy at the Statler Hotel for a while. Another time I was a bellhop at the Book Cadillac Hotel, which became the Sheraton. I did a little act there, wearing one of those uniforms and paging guests. One day I threw away a bunch of telegrams instead of delivering them to the rooms. I denied that it had happened while I was there, but they were time-stamped, and I didn't know that. So they broomed me. I sometimes think that if I had known things like that I might have done better, and maybe even got to be a vice president of something like the Sheraton. But I was pretty ignorant in those days. I was in and out of school a lot, and somewhere along the line I got in a fight with the study hall counselor at Eastern High School, and I got expelled. He kept picking on me, maybe for nothing, maybe just for the sort of things that kids do. But then he started at me talking about you people, and how you people had better learn, and all that. I told him that my name wasn't you people, because you know what it means when they start saying you people. He was talking about Italians, and pretty soon it got kind of nasty and I hit him. And that was all for me in school. As I remember it, I lost most of my jobs for getting in fights with guys who talked about wops and dagos and guineas. Maybe I was just looking for trouble in those days. Maybe I just wanted to keep losing to show my father that he was right and that I was no good. But I was full of anger, and there were a lot of bigots around in those days to take it out on. That night in the juvenile detention home may have saved me from worse. I'll never forget how I felt. Maybe I was no good, but I sure as hell wasn't bad enough to deserve that. After some more drifting from one lousy job to the next, I enlisted in the army. That was at the beginning of 1947, but I fell off a truck and hurt my back during basic training, and they gave me a discharge. But even that didn't come easy. I hated the army. It was almost as bad for me as being in jail. But for a while, they just gave me barracks duty instead of letting me out. Then one day, a sergeant I'd never seen offered to help me get a discharge if I would give him my mustering out pay. For a while, I thought it was some kind of a setup, and that they were trying to catch me bribing an officer. He kept at me, and I tried to ignore him. When my case finally came up and they gave me the discharge, he came and asked for his money. I gave it to him and went home with an honorable discharge. I don't know if he had anything to do with it or not, but I was so glad to get out of there that I gave him the few bucks that I had been paid. When I got home, my mother was glad to see me, but my father started in again with what a bum I was. He told me that not even the army wanted me. He said, "You are no good and you'll never be any good." He said that he should have choked me when I was born. I'll never forget that day as long as I live. With tears in my eyes, hearing my father screaming and hollering all over again, and seeing the tears in my mother's eyes, I left home, working sometimes and hanging out other times, still hearing the screaming and the hollering of my dad's voice, which constantly haunted me. Then, in 1948, I got into some more trouble with the law for being stupid. Another guy and I opened a hat cleaning and blocking and shoeshine shop in our neighborhood. In the back room, we had blackjack and dice games. We thought we had worked out a pretty good system of watching out for the law. One of us would be a lookout in the front of the store, and if somebody who looked like a cop came in, we had a signal with a nail through the wall. The guy in back was supposed to swallow the dice or run away, so there would be no evidence. One day I was up front, and an old buddy from my days at Barber Junior High School came in. We talked about the old days, and he said he was in the construction business. Then he asked to go into the back, and I let him in. When my partner saw him, he recognized that he was a cop and ran out the back way with the dice. The hard way to easy money. It never entered my mind that somebody from our neighborhood could be a cop. It was kind of an insult to even suggest that somebody was a cop. In fact, there's a Sicilian curse that tells a guy he should be a cop. But this guy was a cop. Even though my partner got away with the gambling evidence so that all we had was a friendly card game going on, they gave everybody tickets for loitering. The rule with our kind of joint was that the guys who ran it had to pay the fines when the customers got hit for loitering. So our little business ended up with us holding a stack of tickets we had to pay the fines on. That was the end of my days as a gambling house operator. And it was just as well, because until we got raided, we were making pretty easy money. And for a while, I really believed there was such a thing as easy money, even though I had worked my ass off for most of the money I ever earned in my life. Then there was another string of lousy jobs, fighting, getting broomed, and hanging around with the guys, shooting snooker or whatever else I could do. Sometimes I think that if anybody in those days had treated me decently, I might have stayed on a job and worked my way up to something good. But maybe the reason nobody treated me decently was that I really believed I was no good and acted bad to prove it. I really think I was acting rotten so that my father would know he was right, and then maybe he would love me. I know that sounds crazy, but that's the way people seem to act a lot of the time. Look at the guys who try to make girls love them by beating them and even killing them. It makes no sense, but that seems to be the way people act when they are angry with the world for not treating them right. I finally did get a break from one man, and that started to change my life a little. His name was Abe Saperstein, and he was a very small-scale home builder. What he did was buy up vacant lots in different neighborhoods and hire some people and build small cheap houses on the lots, one at a time, maybe a half dozen or so a year. He wasn't building any Levittown, just a nickel and dime operation. He hired me as a common laborer, which was all I could do. I drove a truck, mixed cement, hauled building materials, and worked at bricklaying and everything else on the houses. In those days, Saperstein built them for maybe $9 and sold them for maybe $12. There wasn't much selling, and what there was he did himself so he wouldn't have to pay commissions. It was mostly about getting money from the bank mortgages and all that. People needed cheap houses, and they bought them if they could finance them. It was such a small operation that I got to see how practically everything was done, and who was brought in to do what we couldn't do ourselves. I got married about the time I came to work for Saperstein, and then our first child was on the way. That and the fact that Saperstein treated me well and let me learn the business kept me there. It was probably the first job I ever had that I stayed for more than a year. It was no big deal, but it was a living, enough to feed my wife, my son Joe, and my daughter Grace. When Saperstein decided to retire, he turned the business over to me. That was not really as big as it sounded because all we had was an old truck, some tools, and a little cement mixer. But I had learned how to put that and some experience together and run it on my own. Detroit's economy has a lot of ups and downs, even more than other places. But in a good year, I could build enough houses, one at a time, scattered around town, to keep things going and make a little more money than I could make on an ordinary job. Things went pretty well for a while, but it was strictly small time. If you got 2 vacant lots together, you could save money by having 2 foundations dug at the same time, buying enough materials and labor to do both together. Even that was larger scale than what we usually did. But it didn't take a genius to see the advantages of getting bigger, so I decided to expand the operation somehow. Saperstein was a decent man. He treated me like a son, and I loved the guy. He taught me a lot, as I moved from truck driver to supervisor to owner. But what I didn't learn was whom to trust and whom not to trust. With the kind of small business we had, trust wasn't important. Nobody trusted us for much for long. So when I went on my own, I didn't know that you're not supposed to believe anything unless you see it in writing. I started looking around for a piece of land where I could build a bunch of houses at one time. All the subcontracting and all the materials could be bought and delivered cheaply. Finally, I found a parcel of land in the suburbs northeast of Detroit. I could build about 50 houses all in one place, and I could build at least 4 at a time and put them up a lot cheaper that way than the way I was doing it. The reason the land was available at a price I could afford was that it was completely undeveloped, mainly meaning no sewers. And around Detroit, people wouldn't buy houses with septic tanks. At first, I wasn't interested in the tract. But then the salesman said, "Don't worry about sewers." I was at City Hall in Mount Clemens, and I heard the word that they were going to start building the sewers out here in the spring. But don't tell anybody I told you, because they don't want to start a lot of land speculation around here. Great, that's what I wanted to hear, so I bought the property on a land contract at a very high rate of interest. But that was okay, because once I got a model home built and started selling from it, there would be a lot of money coming in. It looked like a sure thing. I built the first house, put up signs and ran ads, and waited. To keep operating costs down, I was going to do the selling myself. Every weekend, I'd go out there and sit in that house. Weekends are when people have the time to shop for homes. A lot of people came around to look, and they liked what they saw. The price was right, and there was a lot of buyer interest. But they all asked the same question, are there sewers? I told them what I knew, that the sewers would be in a few months. So they said they would come back when the sewers were in, and I sat there and waited. Meanwhile, I owed money on the land and on the building materials. There is a lot of short-term credit in the building business. You get your money out when you start selling. But I wasn't selling anything, and the short-term credit was getting to be long-term. Everybody was dunning me for money. I was in the hole for about $60,000. It finally dawned on me that I had better find out damned quick about those sewers. So I went to City Hall out there and asked, and everybody looked at me funny. What, sewers? There were no plans for sewers then or ever, I soon found out. In fact, they haven't built sewers out there yet. I never felt so stupid in my life, believing that real estate salesman on a thing like that without checking. But I did believe him, and everything I had done staying out of trouble, working hard for 10 years was down the drain. Finally, it got to the point where, when I came home at night, I would have to park the car a couple of blocks away and sneak into my own house through the alley and over the back fence. The bank was trying to repossess my car. Nowhere to go but up. Then one night I came home in June. My wife asked me for money for groceries. I didn't have any. "What are the kids going to eat?" she asked. How about that for a question? What are the kids going to eat? Here I was a home builder who allowed himself to be conned to the point where everything was gone. Creditors were on my tail. The bank was after my house and car. Bad enough, but now nothing to eat. I sat up the whole night wondering what to do. For a while, the old feelings kept coming back. I was no good, like my father always said. No matter how hard I tried to straighten out my life, it came back to that. But I couldn't forget that question my wife had asked. There was no time to feel sorry for myself. I had responsibilities to other people, to my wife and children, besides the money I owed to my subcontractors and suppliers for work that they had done in good faith. But I wasn't worried at that moment about debts or bankruptcy or my car. Pretty soon all I could think about was getting enough money to feed my family the next day. That was all. Just keep them from being hungry another day. I had known a lot of hunger when I was a kid, when all we ate at home every day was spaghetti, lots of times without even any sauce or anything on it. I was the biggest loser ever, but I was not going to make other people suffer because of what I did or didn't do. I had always made a living for my family. As a kid, I was sometimes the only support. When I worked in factories and made $1.90 a week, my father made me hand over the checks and gave me a couple of bucks for spending money. I always had been able to bring home enough to feed my wife and children, maybe not fancy, but enough until that moment. I didn't spend too much time thinking about how dumb I had been to believe that real estate salesman. If I had, I might have realized that believing him without checking was maybe another way of ruining myself to prove to my father that he was right and that I was no good. By then I had helped him finance and build a little house he lived in during his last years. All I thought about was finding some honest way to get food for my family. That was how I got into the car selling business. That was the start of my becoming the world's greatest salesman. Look back to learn how to look forward better. Chapter 3. It all begins with want. The idea of selling cars for a living had occurred to me before that day. In fact, I had a friend who was a car salesman, and when my building business started going sour, I asked him a few times to get me a job as a salesman. But he never took me seriously and kept brushing me off, telling me that I didn't know anything about selling. In a way that was true. My experience selling houses didn't count for much, because at the low prices I was charging for the few I built, there was no selling. People were glad to get them. All I had to do was sit in the model, make the deal, and arrange for the paperwork. I probably learned more about selling when I shined shoes and sold produce in the streets from the back of a truck than I ever learned selling houses. With the drunks in the bars and the housewives on the street, getting them to notice you and like you was important if you wanted to make a little extra or even to make the sale in the first place. I always had some sense of that. I always had some idea that the way I got a guy to take a shine or to give me an extra tip, or the way I got a housewife to take a dozen ears of corn instead of 6 was to sell me to them. But at this point in my life, all I could think of was getting some kind of work right away. My friend in the car business brushed me off again, so I went to see another man I knew in the business. He was sales manager of a Chevrolet dealership. Right away he explained why I had been getting the brush off. Car salesmen, he said, always feel that there are only a certain number of customers and too many other salesmen. They feel that every time a new salesman comes into the showroom, he is going to take sales away from them. I had suffered from another handicap since I was a kid, and that was that I stuttered badly from the time I was about 8. It seemed to have started from my father beating me. For years it caused me a lot of painful embarrassment, but the kind of work I was able to get didn't require me to have to speak well. I had talked to a lot of people about it, including doctors. They all said pretty much the same thing. Try to talk slower. I tried a lot and I guess it got better sometimes, but there just wasn't all that much pressure on me to improve my speech until I started selling cars. Then I had to do something, and what I had to do was teach myself to concentrate on what I was trying to say and to say it slowly and carefully. I was 35 when I really began working on it, and I soon learned to overcome that handicap because I had to, otherwise we weren't going to eat. Learning to overcome stuttering was one of the most important things that happened to me when I started selling, because it made me think about what I was trying to say and what I should say and what people wanted to hear. That is something that everybody who sells should do all the time, of course. But having that handicap forced me to do it. I not only cured myself of stuttering that way, I also learned some of the fundamentals of communication because I learned to listen and to plan every word I said carefully. It wasn't long before I had got to the point where I almost never stuttered and I almost always said what I wanted to say exactly right. I had bought cars and I knew that the way the business worked was that the salesman stood in a group and when the door opened, whoever was next came up to the customer. But I was desperate, so I said to this fellow, "How about if I don't take any floor time from other salesmen?" He looked at me kind of funny because it didn't make sense. What if I just get customers in other ways than taking turns on the floor? So he said okay, and I was hired. But that didn't mean anything because salesmen in that place didn't get any draw. In fact, they didn't even get a demonstrator to drive until they got to a certain selling level. I had made my arrangement and I was a salesman, but I had no idea where I was going to find customers. I knew that people worked lists, but I didn't know what lists were and how you got them. The only list I knew about was the telephone book, so I figured I'd tear a couple of pages out of the directory. What the hell? It was a list, and everybody on it had a telephone number. In fact, I tore out 2 white pages, and then I figured that business people use trucks and most people aren't home during the day anyway. So I tore out 2 yellow pages. That was my first prospect list, 4 pages from the Detroit telephone directory. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I am sure this would make a dandy story if I said that the first number I picked at random brought me a prospect who came in that day and bought a car from me. Maybe I would tell you that if I thought you would believe it. The first car sale I ever made. No, I made my first sale that day, but it wasn't from a phone call. As a matter of fact, it was from a customer who walked into the showroom just before closing, when all the guys were either busy with customers or on their way home. He walks in and there is no one else there. I look around for about a second, remembering that I had said I wouldn't take any other salesman's floor time. But I was keeping my promise because nobody was there. And by that time I was so desperate that I would have fought anybody who got in my way. Lots of guys framed the first dollar they took in at their new store, and they can recall every detail of the first sale they ever made in their business. You might think that I can recall every detail of that first sale. Or, if I can't, you might think it would be good for this book if I made up a story about that first sale. But I won't do that. I'll tell you frankly that I don't remember the man's name. I don't remember what kind of car he bought. I remember 2 things about that first sale. Just 2 things. One was that he was a Coca-Cola salesman. I probably remember that because it had something to do with grocery stores, and groceries were on my mind a lot that day. The other thing I remember was the feeling I had from the first time I saw the guy that there was no way he was going to get out without buying a car from me. To this day, I cannot remember his face, and for a very simple reason. Whenever I looked at him, all I saw was what I wanted from him, and my want was a bag of groceries to feed my family. I don't remember the pitch I made. I didn't know much about cars or selling or anything in those days, so I know I didn't talk product to him. I had never heard the drill about answering objections, but I am sure that however he stalled, I got him moving again. If he pulled the one about the wife, I am sure that I handed him the phone or got up to drive over with him to his house. I don't know anything more about that man, except that he represented the only way I had at that moment to straighten out my bent life and fulfill my obligations to my family. He was a bag of groceries, and if I sold him, they would eat. Want. My want. That was all I knew. And that want was enough to drive me to say and do enough of the right things to sell him a car. I am not saying that that's all there is to it, then or now, but that is most of it. If you want, and know what you want, you will have most of what you need to be a successful salesman. I mean that. Nobody can be a great salesman without wanting something very much. And the more you want, the more you drive yourself to do what it takes to sell. Maybe the reason that I'm the world's greatest salesman is that there really isn't anything much that you can want more than feeding your hungry family. That doesn't mean that you have to have a hungry family or somebody who needs an operation to save their life or something just as grim in order to sell cars or anything else. But you have to want something, and you have to know what it is, and you have to see every move you make as a way of getting whatever it is you want. Once I saw that Coca-Cola salesman as a bag of groceries to bring home to my family, he was sold, whether he knew it or not. I can't think of anything I have ever wanted as much as that bag of groceries. But I have wanted a lot of other things. I always know what they are, and I try to tie every phone call, every word I say to every customer into fulfilling that want. First, you have to know what you want. Second, you have to know that you can get it if you sell the next prospect. You may think that's a little too simple. You're right, but it's just slightly oversimplified, because it made me a salesman that first day. I didn't know from nothing except my own want and the fact that if I sold this guy, I would get those groceries, and I did it. I sold him, and then I talked the sales manager into lending me $10 to buy a bag of groceries for my family. Don't tell me it doesn't work. Knowing what you want will power your drive.